These are my notes for week 3. This week, our focus is split between Marxism and Deconstruction. Such fun. Last time around, we applied feminism and the psychoanalytical to the first part of Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. This week, we vary things by asking you to look at the end of that same text, but now apply these very different lenses. Our first reading is from Marx. This reading is probably the best bang for your Marxist buck, if Karl will forgive the metaphor. It seriously has everything. The title is The German Ideology, so let's get started with just that word. The Oxford English Dictionary provides 5 possible variants on what exactly we mean by ideology, and I paraphrase them for you here. 1. It is the study of ideas or where ideas come from. 2. It is how ideas are expressed in language. 3. It is deep thinking to produce ideas. 4. It is idealism, and that one's archaic. 5. It is a set of ideas about how things should be that incorporates an action plan to realize them. Now, normally, I'm not big on nitpicking definitions, but if you take in our readings as a whole this week, you can see where each of these, including the rarely used number 4, plays a part in what we're talking about. So in this instance, defining serves us well. In my notes for week 1, I mentioned how in the 19th century, ideas of evolution got tied to ideas about cultural development. Last week, I pointed out how Lewis Henry Morgan incorporated such ideas in his anthropological studies of Native Americans. In our reading this week, Marx is explicit in how he views the linear development of society with nomadic subsistence living at one end and industrial capitalism on the other. And I think you can see how these two authors might be said to be coming at this from the same mindset. Virtually every paragraph from Marx makes a point that is essential to understand his philosophy. So I'm just going to go through and enumerate them. A. We are defined by what we do. This means that we are inherently tied to the type of labor that maintains our lives. When we go around in our everyday life and we identify ourselves by our occupation, we are therefore engaging in a very human activity. B. Within the simplest social setting, the family, there will be a division of labor. The lesson learned is that division of labor increases productivity and the potential for the survival of all. C. As populations grow and people interact at more complex levels, they transfer this fundamental truth about the division of labor to broader social contexts, specializing labor towards communal goals by contributing just one service or product that is traded or sold for the services otherwise needed to live. D. Ownership begins as something associated with the group and only gradually refines to being associated with the individual. E. So what happens in steps C and D requires formal legal agreements and understandings, and the result is a political aspect entering into ideas of labor. Groups band together under a single authority, recognizing and institutionalizing hierarchies. F. This authority will offer laws that tend to be conservative, that favor the retention of existing hierarchies. The society will come to think of these hierarchies as natural, not as structures developed out of human interaction. G. Political authority is ultimately a control of labor. When we think of the development of the bourgeoisie, we tend to think of that as in relation to capital and consumerism, but we can also think of it as they're positioning themselves as the political authorities controlling labor. Last but not least, Marx makes the point about the subtext of his viewpoint about economics and history. If you follow the trail of his narrative, you see that he talks about primitive culture and follows its developments to explain where we are now. He explicitly says, this is understanding the way the world works from the ground up. differentiating it from cosmological systems where the divine word has decreed the order of life. And this is a good premise for a revolutionary. But more importantly, it sets great importance in those fundamental beginnings, in the material existence of human flesh and muscle as the motivator of everything. Again, to bandy a word that Marx might not like, I will say faith in materialism is absolute in the Marxist point of view. And that takes us to Bourdieu. He wrote Structures and the Habitus for us. Much of what 20th century Marxists did was simply expound directly on what Marx established. This piece by Bourdieu works primarily in response to the concept of materiality we just finished with. Bourdieu's point is that we are surrounded by materiality, and our society teaches us to attach certain attitudes toward that materiality. His term for this nexus where materiality and its meaning come together is the habitus, and that is the topic of the article. Bourdieu's argument also hinges on something Marx touches on briefly in The German Ideology, and that is hegemony. When Marx describes how people become habituated to political systems and their rules, growing accustomed to them as normal, the process that allows this to happen is hegemony. Hegemony simply means de facto implicit control. It can be applied directly to an economic situation where a small group corners certain markets, or it can be applied in a metaphorical sense to systems set in place that are intended to channel thought in a certain way so that the status quo is maintained. This latter is to the benefit of those already in control. So what Bourdieu gets at is that the material matrix in which we live is imbued with the values that those in power wish us to assign to that materiality. In other words, everything, including other people and ourselves, is implicitly connected to ideology. That ideology is imposed on the individual by social constraints maintained by the larger group. In turn, that larger group's ideology is regulated by the class which maintains political and economic power. What is insidious about this arrangement is that when everything you can see or touch is an active participant in reinforcing an imposed ideology, the mechanism can only be disabled by the vigilant recognition of this fact. Otherwise, the result will be the reproduction of the exact same ideology in each successive generation. And I'm going to illustrate this by an example provided by one of the great Marxist theorists of the 20th century, Raymond Williams. And he did this in his own arguments about humanity's complex relationship with materiality. Williams points to the English Civil War of the 17th century and provides the crown of Charles I as an example of materiality. First, there really is a crown, a tangible artifact that may rest physically on the head of the sovereign. Next, there is the symbolic value associated with the crown by royalists. It is stability. It means divine election. It's authority in benevolence. Next, there's the symbolic value associated with the crown by Roundheads. For them, it is tyranny, oppression, defiance of the people's will. It's evil. Note, both royalists and parliamentarians are engaged in a political struggle, but politics spills over into feeling about the material. The crown is a pointed example, but a similar feeling could be, and was, associated with everything, on down to the way the Roundheads cut their hair in order to physically oppose the bodily representation of their opponents. Now, take the pointed conflict out of the picture and think about the centuries in which the British Crown went substantially unopposed, when there was only one story for what the Crown stood for. That is the situation that most of us live with, and that is what Bourdieu wants us to be aware of. Lastly, for the Marxists this week, we come to Louis Althusser and ideology and ideological state apparatuses. Now, Althusser comes at us pretty philosophically, and that's not really super surprising, and it makes for an okay change of pace, I think. He presents to us several theses. 1. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. All right. So, going back to my point about treating Marx in the abstract, you can see that is exactly what Althusser is up to. Marx talks about the varying definitions of value. Excuse me. How some are factual and some are simply imposed. Althusser wants to say that this extends beyond just value into the way that we regard everything. We know how to negotiate with our real world, to do what we have to do to exist, subsist, and prosper. This requires that we engage with the ideology of the society we exist within. However, we may not, in our hearts, believe that this is either the best way for things to be or the only way. The individual can be said to put on a mask of the societal ideology to get by. This makes the ideology imaginary in a sense, not real for that person. Although, because the individual may have personal ideals that are not recognized by the society may think of those as imaginary. Regardless, the person actually lives, exists, eats, sleeps, goes to work, and watches Game of Thrones. Second thesis. Ideology has a material existence. In the example from the previous thesis, I posited that the person negotiates with reality by engaging in social ideology. In a capitalist ideology, that means that the person works, because that's what's understood by contributing, whether it is dropping a basket of fries at the Burger King or editing the New York Times. The fact that the person does not think that this is the best way that a society could be run does not matter against the fact that the person still goes to work every day. By functioning within the ideology of capitalism, the individual provides material validation of that ideology. We can see him standing by the fryer. We can ingest the product of his labor. We can see her byline on the page and read her editorial. Thesis 3. There is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects. And like I said, very philosophically phrased. And to be honest, I think this is why most people stay away from philosophy, especially because this thesis can be explained in a very straightforward way. You'll note that the title of this article addresses both ideology as individuals find it and political units that are intended to promote or suppress ideology. For Althusser, this is where we bring a Marxist perspective to its revolutionary edge. Think in terms of building a sentence with a subject and an object, where the subject is the active component and the object receives the action. What Althusser suggests is that you cannot be the victim of a state-driven ideology if you do not actively give in to it. Ideology cannot be imposed, make you its object. It only exists as it is practiced. So, let's revisit that person from the first thesis who only pretends to engage in capitalist ideology. In one sense, no matter the reason that the individual continues to work, the action of working maintains the broad social ideology. However, if the person chooses to work just enough to subsist, but devotes any extra time and labor to giving, say, painting lessons to children, then that practice of the individual imparts their private ideology, valuing aesthetics, sociality, and selflessness to local generations. Each of these points by Althusser goes a little deeper towards looking at things from multiple perspectives. Remember, Marx starts us thinking about ideology in a larger sense. Althusser wants us to think about the way we classify the systems of thought we apply to everything, how we constantly make fluid shifts to negotiate with the world around us and with our own expectations for ourselves. So, Althusser starts with Marx, but he winds up in a very flexible position that allows us to think from multiple angles, the way a deconstructionist would. And that is just where Nietzsche takes things up in The Will to Power. Now we are on the stage of classic philosophy, with the big questions about how do we know anything about what we think we know. On page 467, Nietzsche observes, the will to equality is the will to power. The belief that something is thus and thus, the essence of judgment, is the consequence of a will that things as much as possible shall be equal. So, even in this little snippet, there's a lot to unpack. Nietzsche seems to say that what we seek is a kind of equilibrium or stability as our ultimate goal. As creatures that grow up, grow old, and die, this might be equated with the search for immortality. Significantly, however, Nietzsche puts the power within our minds to alter or assess reality in such a way as to interpret it as having reached that stasis. Effectively, we can lie to ourselves and believe it. On page 469, Nietzsche turns to another subject, which is the subject. Now, we just left off with Althusser, roughly 70 years after Nietzsche, talking about the power that rests within the subject to create ideology. Nietzsche is not anywhere near this optimistic. In the reality of the world that he projects, there is no such thing as real change, merely the change that we decide has occurred. He writes, "Truth is therefore not something there that might be found or discovered, but something that must be created and that gives a name to a process, or rather to a will to overcome that has in itself no end." That's on 470. So we can now look at two philosophers who are essentially butting heads over the way things are. To me, the big issue between Nietzsche and Althusser is materiality. Nietzsche says we have got rid of materiality. Althusser absolutely depends on the materiality of our existence to anchor us in what we are, what we become. So the question comes down to something discussed throughout the last few thousand years of philosophy and religion. How do we define a person? Is it the divine spark that resides within us, the soul? Is it the self-aware intelligence of the mind? Is it the biological material with a certain DNA pattern? Nietzsche comes down on the side of the mind, saying that is what we're all about. Althusser says that we are holistic beings with minds that can shape, but that what we shape is material and real, and that is where we live. One side will be taken up by the deconstructionist, the belief in the materiality of the in the malleability of the realities that we create. The other side will be taken up by the Marxists, who agree that the interpretation of realities through ideology is malleable, but that the material remains solid fact no matter what we think of it. And that takes us to Barbara Johnson and writing. So this one is a very straightforward review of the Deconstructionist project. So I'm not going to say much about it. I will, however, draw your attention to page 533, where Johnson talks specifically about the idea of difference as addressed by deconstruction. In our first week, I mentioned the critic Jacques Derrida. It's Derrida that we owe this concept to. He gives it the French name, différance, in order to show that it is more than just the space in between this and that. It is that, and it is the parts where they overlap or combine. It's looking at them up or down, left, right, so that we can see this and that in all of its permutation, roundly and fully considered. On one level, it's the kind of thing that good scholars are always supposed to do, leaving nothing for granted. On another, it evokes a sense in which we must invest so much work into knowing every little thing that we must soon realize it's impossible to move on to any larger thing and know it in the same way. Lastly, we have Gilles Deleuze and what is becoming. I'm not a huge fan of Deleuze, and if I tell you that this is one of the most readable pieces I've ever seen from him, that might indicate why. This is nothing against his ideas, which are marvelous. Together with his longtime collaborator, Félix Guattari, Deleuze is regarded as one of the top theorists in the world. It might be said that the two of them have consistently taken deconstruction to its logical ends, regularly offering readings that focus on the fractured nature of the individual, how what we consider identity is a fluid melange of the influences we encounter. It's a kind of chaos theory of the self, and it really is breathtaking. While I love what Deleuze says, I don't enjoy the way he says things. The last time I talked about deconstruction, I mentioned Lyotard and his language games. We can see that at work here in Deleuze, especially where he offers quotes from Lewis Carroll where the words question their own definition. One of them is, if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds. The implication is that if you don't cut it very deeply, it won't. And this is arguably true if we get to arguing about layers of dermis. But the common sense understanding of cutting the finger is that it is essentially breaking through layers of dermis. Otherwise, it's not a cut. That idea of common sense is exactly what Deleuze is trying to draw your attention to. A set of received wisdom composed of truisms that we tend not to question. Remember, in deconstruction, our acceptance of received systems of understanding is a self-imposed limit, an action that actually restrains us from inquiry. And I can give an example of this in real science. In this past September, biologist Kenneth Catania published a paper on electric eels in which he described eels in his laboratory jumping from the water in order to attack perceived threats. Anecdotal evidence of such actions has been around for centuries. People have always told stories about eels, electric eels jumping up and getting people, but it has never been observed scientifically. The behavior went unrecognized until this year. Simply put, the received wisdom was that eels shock their prey in the water, and that was it. So even though it's entirely unlikely that Catania was the first biologist to ever witness this behavior, he was the first to notice it and contextualize it against the received wisdom and say, hey, they're not supposed to do that. This is exactly what deconstructionists say we do all the time. We just go along with what we've been told, and when we do that, we forego the chance to actually extend our knowledge. That is what Catania didn't do. The other thing that we can see going on in the Deleuze article is how he dissects the binary. That's right up front when he talks about Alice getting larger and how we cannot understand the concept of larger without also taking smaller into account. Unlike the Marxist who would ask us to think about this inherent relationship of ideas as a basis to create a broader understanding of the way we think about things, Deleuze emphasizes how such understandings are tied to our sense of movement through time. As we move forward, the information and the situation alter along with us, and there is therefore no chance of nailing down hard and fast concepts the way the Marxist would. Instead, we must be flexible and adapt moment by moment as we are in a constant state of becoming so long as we exist. Deleuze would ask that we embrace that becoming. Now, as always, if you need or want more, all you have to do is ask. Write, call, post. I will get with you. I promise.